On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, what does a railroad strike mean for shipping? I'm your host, Sam Mercaglano. Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping. If you're new to the channel, take a second, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So in the year and a half this channel has been up and running, we have covered the maritime aspect of the global supply chain ever since Ever Given went sideways in the Suez back in March of 2021. Recently, we featured a couple of videos that focus on immediate issues facing the global supply chain. Issues like the Federal Maritime Commission talking about taking over ports, including the allocation of data. We talked about the issue about the Port of Los Angeles asking to bring your cargo here to us. We talked about the disappearance of vessels off the Port of Los Angeles and even the shifting of vessels from the West Coast of the United States over to the East and Gulf Coast. But now we face a new issue, and that's an impending, looming potential strike by Class 1 railways in the United States. Let's go ahead and jump to the story. This is a story by Lorianne LaRocco. It was in CNBC. She reports for both them and FreightWaves. She's a noted transportation reporter, and her report talks about what the potential is should railway workers go on strike on Friday, September 16th. The Association for the American Railways have estimated that a strike of the Class 1 railways in the United States could equate to $2 billion a day economic impact. The unions were in a 30-day cooling off period because of their renegotiation. That expires on September 16th, and that's the moment when the unions can strike. They're no longer under a federal mandate not to strike. Now, 5 of the 12 unions have made agreements with their parent companies. However, the 3 biggest unions have not. The president put together an emergency board to basically help mediate, including sending the Secretary of Commerce, Marty Walsh, to assist. That board, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, have helped in some of this. But again, we're at an impasse here. And even though they've been able to get an increase in wages, the most substantial increases in 40 years, it is not enough for those big unions. And what we're seeing now are stories like this, which is talking about that the Class 1 railways are going to suspend security-sensitive shipments ahead of potential strikes. They don't want to see loaded cargo of hazardous materials sitting on railways unguarded and not moving. And so we're going to start seeing slowdowns in the shipment on rails starting on Monday. Now, there's a lot of issues behind the surface here that's going on. It's very easy to point fingers here and blame a lot of things, but understand this has been a long, ongoing process in the railway industry. Now, I do global shipping mainly. I don't do railways. However, shipping doesn't work. You can't just pour cargo into a port and that's it. You've got to be able to get it out of the port, which means truck, which means rail, which means air. You need all of this. All of this is part of that larger intermodal. So if you want a good background on this, I'd really recommend this story here by Rachel Premack. Did it back in July. It was a great story. Really covered all the bases here of what's going on in the rail industry and why it's so chaotic. A good primer for you to take a look at. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that she talked about in here, that there's 2 kind of issues that are underlying this. And she talks about it here with 2 sneaky tricks railroads love and shippers hate. So one of them is this institution of precision scheduling railroads. You talk about railroads running like railroads, they run on set times and everything. And while that's true of passenger railroads, freight railroads are a lot different. And one of the things that freight railroads would do is wait until they were loaded before they would go, and then you would change schedules to accommodate that. However, the railroads went to basically precision scheduling. In other words, if a train's going to leave at 8 a.m., it leaves at 8 a.m., whether it's loaded or not. It's going to go. It's going to go with the cargo it has. And if you don't make it on that cargo, it's going to go another time, which sounds like it should be really efficient. But one of the problems is it causes backlogs in cargo. If that train runs short or the train is not fully loaded, then that cargo has got to go to another one. The other aspect that she talks about here that's really important is this idea of super long freight trains. So one of the things that railroads have done very similar to ocean shipping is they have gotten longer and bigger on their rail cars. Trains, not the cars, but the trains themselves. So, 2 mile long trains, with less people on board. Whereas you may have had a crew of 4 working a rail road before, or a rail train before, 2 in the engine, two in the end in the caboose. Now you're maybe just running 2. And problems are that when you run into an issue and you've got to walk the entire train, you may be walking a mile or 2 train with just one person doing that. And this just slows down the process. It also diminishes your labor pool that you can draw upon because you're running less people on there. Add COVID into the mix, and what you saw was railroad payrolls went down substantially. They were basically trimming personnel out of them all the time. And then when all of a sudden the freight picked back up, there wasn't enough personnel to run the number of trains that were needed. And what we're seeing here, and she reported here, is that the railroad surface is suffering even as the volumes tick down. We're seeing, train speed decreasing. We're seeing dwell time in terminals increase. And basically what we're seeing is across the board an entire breakdown in the Class 1 railways. And as Rachel predicted back in July, this situation can get dire very quickly if this strike happens. And so the looming strike has the potential to break it down. Now, what do I mean? What happens if the Class 1 railways go on strike? Well, let's look at what Class 1 railways are first. So this is a great little interactive map that I found on Class 1 railways in North America, both the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And one of the things that's very apparent here that should kind of stand out for you, number one, is all the major U.S. ports have railways in them. Houston, LA Long Beach, Seattle Tacoma, Oakland, New York, New Jersey, Savannah, New Orleans, Jacksonville, Charleston, Virginia. All of them are hooked into the major railways. And then within the interior of the United States, there are central hubs. Now, railways are different. There are different railways out there. So there's not one central railway. There are a series of companies that operate the railways for the United States, along with the other countries that border us. So, for example, right here, Norfolk Southern. So the Norfolk Southern Railway operates in a specific kind of geographic area. Then you have the CSX railways, focused mainly on the East Coast. Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which is basically west of the Mississippi, not exactly, but close. Kansas City Southern, which is in the interior part of the United States, runs down to the Gulf of Mexico coast and into Mexico itself. Union Pacific, which runs from the West Coast all the way to the Midwest. And then the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National lines that operate in Canada, but also through the center part, the Midwest part of the United States, and part of the Northeast. So all these companies operate from geographic areas. They interoperate between cargo that has to be transloaded. And then, of course, you have these major railway hubs, particularly in the Midwest portion of the United States, where rail is offloaded, transferred, and moved. And this is where you move a good chunk of the cargo that comes out of the port. So, for example, let's look at the port of Los Angeles. So this diagram came from Jean-Paul Rodrigues' Port Economic Management. And in it, it's a case study he did of the port of LA and Long Beach. And it's from a few years ago, but it's a good kind of snapshot at the time. We're moving a lot more containers out of there now, almost 20 million. But at the time, they were moving about 15.8 million containers out. And one of the things you see here is how containers are moved out of the port. About 5.6 million are being moved almost exclusively by truck. And so they're coming out of the terminal by truck. And so that's that drayage that we talk about, where they're moving to local destinations, to distribution centers, or for long haul trucking, maybe across state. Then about 3.8 million are moving within the terminal, with on dock rail. Basically, they're loading on board railways right there in the port, heading out through the Alameda corridor and then out into local destinations. And then the rest of this material is also moving on train and through a variety of different means. So, for example, about 3.6 million are moved by truck to distribution centers, and then that material is unstuffed from the 40-foot and 20-foot containers into new containers. So, for example, if you're shipping phones over, you don't need to ship, an entire 40-foot trailer of phones to certain areas. What you need is to pack different types of phones and different types of material. And so they go in these distribution centers, they reshuffle the containers, and then they're going to off dock rail for their transportation. And then another group of containers are, heading off on trucks to off dock rail yards, being loaded on rail and being shipped. And then another group is being put onto near dock rail and then being shipped. And so what you see here is that there's a large amount of material here that's moving by truck, but also by rail. And if you look at the material coming out of the Port of Los Angeles right now, you'll see that. So, for example, sitting right now at the Port of Los Angeles is about 49,000 imported containers. These are the containers that are sitting there waiting to get picked up. This is the metric we've been following quite extensively since the backup. This data goes all the way back to 24 October, back when they were at about 94,000 containers. And you'll see it went down pretty far back in January, started to tick back up, and now it's ticking back down as the amount of freight is cutting back. But 49,000 containers. And based on their latest report from the Port of LA, you'll see that right here, that total import containers on terminal are 49,046. But the total number of on-dock rail waiting to load, the amount that's waiting to get on a train, is 26,486. So over 50% of that container material is waiting to get on rail to get out of there. What happens with the strike is the big danger. If that rail goes away, we're going to see those number of containers in those terminals begin to accumulate rapidly because there is not enough trucks and drayage out there to handle this. Go over here to their port optimizer. This is the data here that basically the port puts out every day. I'm going to remove myself here from this. On the left there is outgated container metrics for trucks, talking about the total volume there of how much is going out. And they do these by kind of weeks, how much is going out, and then totaling them up. And then what you see here is weeks for rail. And what you see here is that rail, which is basically less than what we see going out with trucks right now, and this is a big issue, is we've seen this slowdown in rail. Rail is not going out as much as trucks, whereas before it was almost a 50-50 split. Now we're seeing less rail going out. And more importantly, we're seeing the growth of the delay. Over here, most truckloads are 0 to 4 days waiting. 70% of them are 0 to 4 days. And if you throw in really the 5 to 8 days, that's almost everything. You get almost just about 5-6% of truck is sitting there for more than 9 days. Whereas here, you look at containers sitting here for more than 9 days, that's a third. A third of them are sitting there for 9 days. A quarter of them are sitting there for 5 to 8 days. And then the other remainder is there from 0 to 4 days. And so this is a substantial problem. And if rail goes away, then we're going to see the issue become even more pronounced. And this is just the Port of LA. And one of the videos I just talked about recently was, where the ships go from the Port of LA and how containers are shifting to the East and Gulf Coast. This report here by Lodestar talks about the strain that East Coast rail is under because of this new flow of cargo coming in. And Lodestar is talking about how Norfolk Southern is struggling to cope with container volumes coming into Kansas City and Memphis from ports on the eastern seaboard. And what this means is they're having problems shuffling all these containers in and dealing with them. So the potential for a rail strike is something you should be well aware of, because while we're talking about freight rates coming down, while we're talking about a slowing down of global shipping, if all of a sudden you can't get those containers out of the terminals will fill back up, the ships will not be able to unload. And then what we're going to see is the resurgence of backloads in a lot of ports. We still have backloads in ports like Savannah, off Houston, off New York, New Jersey, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that rail can't get the containers out as fast. This is the next black swan event looming on the horizon. And if we don't come to a settlement by Friday and the rail workers decide to go on strike, that is going to cause chaos across the supply chain, something that we all need to be aware of and a danger. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media. Please share it. Put it across any social media platform you want. Give it a thumbs up. And if you can, contribute to the Patreon page. Patrons of this page can support the page through a variety of different levels and means, one time, monthly, yearly, however they want to do it. Or you can hit the super thanks button below. Just hit that, contribute directly to the page, and I appreciate it. Until our next video, this is Al, signing off.